So, hi everybody. Welcome to our Lunch and Learn. Thanks very much for joining. If it is your lunchtime, taking time out wherever you are to have a listen to this. I'm Finlay. I'm part of this group called Safe Landing. We are for aviation workers within the sector, trying to push our industry to be more sustainable and have difficult conversations around sustainability. I'm a former aerospace engineer. We've also got Maxine on the call here, who can fly electric aircraft. And yeah, we're a global group open to any aviation worker, whether you're a pilot, cabin crew, engineer, airport worker. Please check out our website and send us an email if you would like to discuss anything with us. Just a kind of background to some of our broad principles as a group. We think our industry should be honest about the total environmental impact of flying, realistic about the limits of technology to solve this problem. And this is why we need to focus particularly on sustainable aviation fuel, be transparent about what regulations are required to reduce emissions, and have a plan that accounts for this and supports workers during any transition. Then, based on that, we've got some positions. So we think flying does have a high environmental impact and is highly inequitable. It's not fairly distributed, and we want to be honest about that situation. We don't think technology, including fuels, will be available at scale in the time required, which is really basically 10 years now. And we need to keep that time scale in context when we're looking at these solutions. So we think future regulations are vital. This includes limiting air traffic. Acknowledging this and planning for this is in all of our best interests. So today, we are going to cover our position on sustainable aviation fuel. And this is something we've developed over a few years. We put a post on our website the other week, but this is open for debate, and we're really keen to share this, foster conversation, dialogue, feedback, adjust and modify our position to make it more reasonable. So thanks very much for everyone that's joined, and really looking forward to having a good discussion and getting some feedback. So what is a sustainable aviation fuel? When we talk about sustainable aviation fuel, we're generally referring to biofuels or electro-fuels. So biofuels are created from biomass. That could be from crops, could be food waste, farm waste, forestry waste, anything where a plant's grown, whereas electro-fuels are produced from electricity. And both of these fuels aims to substitute conventional jet fuel, what we call kerosene, that's produced from fossil fuels. Now, just as a kind of starting point, we want to discuss whether this term sustainable aviation fuel is really honest and appropriate. Yeah, we prefer to use the term alternative jet fuel rather than sustainable aviation fuel, because this avoids assuming that any alternative to fossil fuel is by definition sustainable. I think a big issue at the moment is by labeling everything SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, as a coverall, it then stops us diving a bit deeper in assessing the genuine sustainability of some of these feedstocks. We think that sustainability should be assessed and critiqued rather than just assumed. And we think this wording is actually quite dangerous because it stops us doing this. There has been a recent court case against KLM in Europe, where they've been ordered to not use this term in public-facing communications. And we think we should, as such, we should be doing this in the environmental movement and within Safe Landing. So we prefer to use the term alternative jet fuel instead. So what is alternative jet fuel? What's the principle behind it? So the problem at the moment is we've got fossil fuel, carbon that's been stored underground, deep underground for many thousands of years, and it's very stable, and we've stabilized our atmosphere. What we do is we extract that, we process it into a variety of fuels for our cars, power stations, aircraft. That puts additional carbon into the atmosphere, unbalances it, and is causing global warming. So with these fuels instead, what we look to do is take carbon out of the atmosphere that's already there, process it into a fuel and use that instead. One of these options is biofuel, growing trees, growing agricultural crops. Another option is to take water, split it into hydrogen to make a hydrogen fuel. We can also industrially capture carbon from the atmosphere using direct air capture. And if we power this with renewable electricity, we could combine the carbon and the hydrogen from these sources and make a liquid hydrocarbon fuel that can replace fossil fuels. So it seems like quite a nice circular economy here. And you can see why it's quite an appealing thing for aviation workers to think, oh, we can just replace fossil fuel with a alternative jet fuel, and we won't be adding additional carbon to the atmosphere. So I usually start with biofuels. I'm going to start with electro-fuels for a change. This is electricity, turning that into a jet fuel. So how does this work? If you just think about conventional fossil jet fuel for a minute, we've got stored carbon underground. We extract that and we get crude oil. We then refine that. We get gasoline, diesel, kerosene out. That's jet fuel. We burn that in an aircraft and we get carbon that goes into the atmosphere. What you can do, first thing, is you can have a carbon capture facility that captures carbon from the air and puts it back underground. That's one option. The next option, and you can power that with renewable electricity. The next option is to actually use the electricity to firstly split water. That's hydrogen and oxygen into separate hydrogen and oxygen. So you've got hydrogen coming out. You can then also power direct air capture, or you can take carbon from a power station or industrial process to get a source of carbon. So you've got some carbon and some hydrogen. You can combine those to make a liquid hydrocarbon, and that's your e-fuel, your electro-fuel that then goes into your aircraft, produces the CO2, and that's recaptured again. Noting that there's other non-CO2, non-carbon emissions that aren't recaptured. The problem with this is it's a very inefficient use of electricity. So all of those processes I showed here, particularly the electrolysis of hydrogen, but also direct air capture, and also the fuel synthesis itself, are very inefficient processes. This means you have to put a lot more energy in than you get out. You actually basically end up with about 10% energy left once you've burned it in an aircraft. What that means is, as I say, it's the most inefficient use of electricity. So what you find is that if you have 1 unit, 1 megawatt hour, or whatever of low carbon electricity, and you use it for different purposes, you get a lot more savings if you use that electricity to displace coal or gas on the grid, to power an electric car, displace petrol or diesel, or a heat pump, and displace a gas boiler in a home. You even save twice as much energy if you just power direct air capture rather than producing synthetic jet fuel. So I think something is kind of concept that we really need to understand is this idea of a carbon opportunity cost from using 1 unit of renewable electricity for this rather than something else. It is kind of nice to think maybe we have unlimited renewable energy, so we can just do this. But actually, the reality is there's real limits on how much renewables we can build due to planning, due to the time it takes to build wind and solar out. There's lots of energy, lots of fossil fuels still being used elsewhere we need to displace. So particularly in the near term, the next 10, 20 years, if we do produce lots of e-fuel, that will be diverting electricity from elsewhere. If you just look at the total energy requirements as well, I've done this calculation for the UK. I've hidden the calculation from the screen, but this is how much energy it would take to replace all of the UK's jet fuel with electro fuel. That's basically equivalent to the entire UK electricity grid, including fossil fuel, which is that grey box. So we need twice the low carbon energy, including nuclear, to produce this, or we need 3 times if you don't include nuclear. You need 4 times the wind generation, or you need 5 times our current nuclear capacity. And the UK has a relatively high amount of nuclear energy compared to other countries. So this just gives you a scale of how much energy is required. At a global level, this is a quote from an industry report. You can see Airbus, Boeing, Shell, BP, EasyJet in there. They're recognizing that if we use liquid hydrogen and synthetic fuel, we'd need 3 to 4 times the renewable electricity produced globally today, or 20 to 30 times the renewable energy produced in Europe. So this is huge amounts of energy at a time when we need to decarbonize every other sector. And we've also got kind of growing electricity use from computing and AI and things like that as well. So our positions on e-fuels, we think they are currently too energy intensive to scale significantly without diverting limited electricity from elsewhere. I've obviously missed a bullet point here. So while other sectors, the grid, ground transport, heating and industry are decarbonising, there's an opportunity cost to diverting electricity. Within aviation, it appears more efficient to just tax jet fuel and fund carbon capture rather than produce e-fuel. However, direct air capture itself is less efficient than electric vehicles or heat pumps. And in the near term, we think we should ramp up aviation fuel pricing, carbon pricing, but use this money to fund renewables primarily and direct electrification of other sectors rather than wasting most of that energy as heat producing a jet fuel. And yeah, that bullet point that was missing there is something that's fundamental, is we need a cross-economy prioritization of renewable electricity before assuming huge quantities for SAF. So maybe there is some areas where there's a lot of renewable electricity and very little demand. It does make sense to produce hydrogen, for example. We also need to check, do we need that hydrogen for fertilizer, for farming, and for other things? I need to consider that before assuming we can have all energy everywhere for e-fuel production. So moving on to biofuels. Now, there's quite a few different types of biofuel. Split them into some categories here. So the first one is we've got first generation biofuels. These are crop-based from vegetable oil primarily. We've then got waste oil and fat. This is where most sustainable aviation fuel comes from at the moment. There's then other waste. So there's food waste, there's farm waste, and there's forestry waste. And this covers most of the biofuel we talk about. We do also sometimes include plastic waste in here, which isn't particularly biogenic as well. So crop-based biofuels first. What is the issue? So the danger with crop-based biofuels is they actually produce more emissions than fossil fuel. You can see for rapeseed, soy, palm oil, these are all higher than just burning fossil fuel. The average is 80% higher as well. And this is because of the land use change associated with the land use from these fuels. Just looking at America, the US, this is the past 40 years. And you can see that the corn use, most of it is being used for animal feed, a little bit actually directly as food, and then a growing proportion over the last 25 years for biofuels. This is primarily used in cars for road transport. So you can see right now we're using so much of it, far more to power and feed cars than we are to feed people. What's the problem with that? Well, if you have a hectare of land and you put a solar panel on it and you power an electric car, this is how many kilometers you can drive. Whereas if you plant corn on that area and you burn it in a car, this is how far you can drive instead. So it's incredibly inefficient use of land. This is because plants just take a lot of energy to grow. It's sort of 1-2% efficiency solar to energy conversion versus 20% efficiency from a solar panel. At the moment, providing 10% of US road transport uses 25 million hectares of US land. If we covered that land in solar panels instead, we could produce 3 times current US grid production. If you want to just produce one, replace all grid production with solar, you then free up 17 million hectares of land for rewilding. If you just want to power the car fleet, you could have 23 million hectares of land. So if we can get ourselves off crop-based biofuels, we provide ourselves with a lot more land that we can use to rewild and help return carbon to the soils and allow biodiversity to survive. So at the moment, if you just look at aviation fuel use, currently, this is how much aviation fuel we use globally. This is how much biofuels we produce. They're all those dangerous crop-based biofuels, though. So even if we converted all of that to aviation, we could only supply a third of current demand without any growth. It's the same if you look at just the US, it's about a third, but that would be a bad idea. We'd be moving all of our crop-based biofuel over to aviation. Now, this is something our industry is lobbying for, and something as a group we want to push back on. So as well, just thinking globally, there's a reference here, but we think business as usual growth, if we provided that with 100% biofuels, we'd need about 300 million hectares. That's an area about the size of India, which is basically one of the biggest countries in terms of farmland, kind of equivalent to the US. So we need to cover the entire thing, entire country in crop-based biofuels to meet aviation demand. Just doing the same calculation for the UK, the Royal Society estimated we need half of farmland in the UK to meet UK jet fuel demand. So our summary here is just avoid crop-based biofuels. We really think it's a sort of environmental dead end. We really risk wasting a lot of our time, money, and resources on something that's a false solution. In 10 years' time, we're going to agree that this is unsustainable and we'll need to stop it, and we'll regret what we've done. We can already look back at the last 15 years of this with regret, and we should try and move away from it as soon as possible. However, last week, there was news about in the US, still subsidies are being given to corn ethanol. So even, in May 2024, this is still happening, and you can read more about it in the pack. So what is the industry? In Europe, the industry is saying we're not going to use crop-based biofuels. We're going to use waste instead. The first one that comes up is this pathway called HEFA, which is from waste oil and fat. So you've got waste oil, you've got animal fat from slaughtering animals and taking the inedible fat. Just as a reference, flight across the Atlantic, Paris to New York, we'd need to kill about 9,000 pigs to get enough animal fat for that, which is clearly not particularly ethical or ecological or sustainable. The problem with used cooking oil is there's just not that much of it. And if we maximize demand, we end up importing a lot of it from other countries. At the moment, North America and Europe import a large quantity from Asia. This is where there's a lot of palm oil being grown. If we incentivize a large amount of used cooking oil being used here for aviation, it's quite likely that in Asia they switch to more palm oil, and we indirectly cause the same impacts as crop-based biofuel. And again, there's an article you can read more about that. However, this is the UK's plan for jet fuel. We're aiming for 10% by 2030, and we're allowing 7 or 8% of that to come from this HEFA waste oil fat supply. Now, we know that actually HEFA waste oil fat, we can only really get to about 2% sustainably using domestic supplies before we start basically like using more than is our fair share, and we'll incentivize these negative practices. So there's a big emphasis at the moment on a fuel that is just fundamentally not scalable. The other ones on this graph, this is biomass. So there's industrial flue gas, and there's lignocellulosic biomass is the blue. You can see that's potentially more scalable, but that's from waste, forestry, farm waste that is more difficult to collect and process, as we'll get into in a second. Now, the industry admits, even though this is like the only commercialized SAF feedstock, it's the only one we're really planning to scale in large quantities this decade. Industry CEOs themselves say there isn't enough cooking oil in the world to power a day of green aviation. Qatar Airways CEO says we're not going to reach the 2030 targets. There's not enough raw material. This isn't something that I'm sort of saying is behind closed doors knowledge. It's something the industry is openly admitting, yet this is the main part of our strategy. The other thing I just want to touch on is at the moment, as I say, we're in the UK, about 80% of our used cooking oil comes from Southeast Asia. You think about it, it's being collected from fast food places in Asia, or potentially fraudulent supplies, shipped halfway across the world in a tanker, and then processed into a jet fuel here so that we can fly. But literally, there's aircraft that take off every day in Southeast Asia that can make use of the fuel there and minimize the supply chain. So does it make sense to be doing this? Does it sound environmental? The other aspect is whether we use it in the UK or China or wherever, does it make sense to turn it into biodiesel or turn it into jet fuel? And basically, it's far more efficient to turn this into biodiesel that can be used in ground transport and produce some jet fuel. If we end up prioritizing jet fuel, the efficiency of the process goes down. We get less fuel and less carbon savings as well. So that's dangerous. So just our positions on this. We think we should prioritize a reduction of waste oil and fat in the first place, prioritize local production, prioritize ground transport over jet fuel production. We should cap heifer at lower quantities, particularly in North America and Europe, to prevent creating a fraud market, diverting local fuel production, diverting from ground transport, and also fundamentally like distracting our industry from attention to other more scalable fuel pathways that might be more expensive to develop, but we fundamentally need to get them at scale. So if we go and have a look at food waste next, you can go into the United Airlines website. They're using Sesame Street character for basically saying what we can convert food waste into fuel. There's an advertising campaign on YouTube that's very cuddly friendly and has people thinking, yeah, this is possible. They even mention algae-based biofuels in this short commercial, but if you read the small print, SAF is less than 0.1% of United's overall fuel use. Algae is not currently used to make SAF. So quite misleading, this entire thing, and it's putting kind of a cuddly, friendly face on this. So what's the reality? Reality, well, in the UK, this is a facility that's getting $1 billion of private investment. The government have given it quite a few million. Now, this is converting municipal solid waste, black bin waste. Now, that will be a lot of plastic, maybe food waste that people have put into the bin. So it could also include plastic waste as well. If you think about plastic waste, what we're doing is we're extracting fossil fuels, we're producing some plastic, we're collecting it, we're reprocessing it into a jet fuel and burning it again. So eventually, fossil carbon ends up in the atmosphere. But we're adding all these additional processes, which are in themselves emissions intensive, and it's not really any more sustainable. The other thing is, let's just say we can separate all the plastic from the food waste. Something you can do with food waste is you can take it to an anaerobic digester. This produces organic biogas that can go into the grid, an organic fertilizer that can be used in the farm. This retains nutrients from food in the soil, not just carbon, but also phosphorus, potassium, etc., and stops us needing to produce even more fossil fuel fertilizer. If you look at what the government says about this, they say we should be prioritizing recycling and nutrients to produce fertilizer over energy recovery, whether that's at an incinerator or producing jet fuel. And yeah, so basically we should be ideally prioritizing animal feed, surplus food to make biomaterials like rice husks to make coffee cups, and anaerobic digestion, composting, before we get down to recovering the energy from the waste. Just why this is important with fertilizers, we're also running out of the ingredients for making fertilizers. Firstly, we use fossil fuels, but also we collect phosphorus, and we're also really worried that we're running out of this stuff as well because we're putting onto our fields, and we're not returning it. So there's more that we need to consider outside of aviation here. Other waste-based biofuels. I put a couple of articles here that says there is enough waste-based biofuels. We're going to be okay. We need to not worry. I would recommend you checking out these articles because maybe they are correct, but we just want to provide a little bit of realism to this. So one of the problems with waste-based biofuels is there isn't that much of it, and there's competing uses. So if it's farm waste, we could turn this into biochemicals. If it's straw, obviously animals eat that, animals sleep on it. The same with manure. This could be used for fertilizer. It could also be used for heating on the farm. Sawdust bark, just thinking about it, we can make coffee cups from rice husks or insulation from sawdust. There's multiple uses of this stuff before we even consider like composting it, digesting it, or making a fuel. Going back to what the industry says, biofuels reliance on feedstock, changes in land use, water use, monoculture mean that aviation will be competing with other interests that need that feedstock for other purposes. So this is a risk we have identified as an industry. If you look at what Transport and Environment say, they've done an assessment of how much advanced biofuels will be available. This is, I think, in Europe, and they reckon we can maybe get to 11% of aviation demand in 2050. The competing uses we need to consider, so fertilizer production, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, road transport fuels, because we're not going to be able to fully electrify those until 15, 20 years' time, shipping fuels, bioplastics, and we're not doing a cross-sector analysis and prioritization of this. This is a chart from Shell showing low, medium, high estimates of biofuel. Aviation could potentially use the entirety of the low estimate, but as could the chemical sector. That's where the bioplastics are coming from, and other things as well. And then we've got a variety of other sectors, and even assuming a high estimate for biomass, the potential demands are out competing that. And that's why, maybe aviation should get some of this, but should we assume it gets all? I think that's a really dangerous assumption. Looking at just a different chart as well from Committee on Climate Change, they've got this low, medium, high estimate of supply as well. Aviation, again, could use all of the high estimate, but also you've got potential for bioplastics and also bioenergy, carbon capture. So if we blow our carbon budget, which we look like we're on track to, we need to extract carbon from the air. Direct air capture is very energy intensive, it's very expensive. You can imagine governments are putting more pressure on this, and it might be that we certainly need all our waste from that to avoid crop-based BECCS as well. So these are all risks that we think we need to be aware of. So our positions, we think biofuels are not scalable to a significant percentage of jet fuel demand without diverting limited sustainable biomass from elsewhere. We think we should prioritize reductions of all biomass waste as a priority, use local use of biomass where it is collected. Again, this cross-economy prioritization of sustainable biomass before assuming we use a lot for SAF. Prioritize fertilizer production over jet fuel production. And if we do prioritize it for jet fuel, we should definitely assume it will be high cost because it's difficult to collect, it's difficult to process, and that means that we can't just assume that it's going to be staying like 1-2 times the cost of jet fuel. It might well be 3, 4, 5 or more times the cost, and we need to plan for that as an industry. So just a summary of our positions, and then we can wrap up and get some questions. So firstly, I think stop using the term SAF, start using alternative jet fuel instead. Perform cross-economy prioritization, both for biomass and renewable electricity. Primarily, we think focus on SAF is distracting us from policies targeting fossil fuels. So we need a carbon budget for aviation that reduces each year. We need financial policies that target fossil fuels to raise revenue like jet fuel tax and frequent flyer levy. We don't think biofuels are scalable. And while e-fuels appear more scalable because they use less land, in theory, they're so energy intensive that they will divert limited electricity from elsewhere. Then again, we don't think these SAF targets, the 2030 targets, will be met. It's almost physically impossible, particularly if we grow air traffic. And then funding. So we know that these fuels, whether it's electro-fuels or advanced biofuels, will be far more expensive than conventional jet fuel today. This should be paid for by air travelers. Governments aren't going to be able to afford the trillions it's going to cost for these fuels, and we need to factor that into business models within the aviation sector. Some varieties of SAF are particularly unsustainable and unscalable, and we risk spending a lot of money and wasting a lot of time on the wrong technologies if we're not more critical. We prefer government money to be spent, if it's in the energy sector, on building renewables, If it's in the transport sector, ideally public, electrified ground transport, and within the aviation sector, on more efficient aircraft designs that minimize total fuel burn to minimize the impacts of any fuel type that we can produce. And I think, yeah, that's the end of my pack. I'm kind of rattled through that because I was a bit concerned about the level of detail. I do have some more stuff, but I'm really keen that we maximize the amount of time for questions and discussion. So yeah, I'm just gonna check the chat. But if you do have a question, feel free to like put up your hand. Or yeah, feel free to ask a question in the chat and we'll check it out. Katie, you can go first.
Hi, Finley. Thank you very much. That was really interesting. So my question would be, is there a technology that you do have some optimism or faith about? And if so, which ones or which one?
So there's basically we think that probably there's going to be a mixture of aircraft. If you look at in 2050, what aircraft will there be? I think there'll be electric aircraft to some extent at shorter haul. There might be some hydrogen in the medium, and there might be a mixture of electro-fuels and advanced biofuels in longer haul. But the most important thing is like how many flights are there and how much energy are we using everywhere? So the emphasis is really on minimizing energy use so that we can minimize all of those because they all have have potential to work, but they all have negative impacts. So it really is about minimizing those. So long term, like we might be able to have mostly batteries and electro fuel, but it's recognizing as well we have a transition period until then where we need to decarbonize other sectors, and it doesn't make logical sense to use the energy right now for that. So that's why we're saying if you scale renewables for the next couple of decades, but prioritize it for other stuff, we will hopefully get to the point where we have a stable climate and we have more and more abundant renewable electricity, and then we can afford to waste more of it on hydrogen and on e-fuel production, and we can use it then. But in the meantime, particularly the next 2 decades, it actually we kind of makes more logical sense just to build renewables and use them for other things first. So it's not that in 30 years we can't use e-fuels, but it's just if we try to replace all of it in aviation this decade, we'd end up diverting it from elsewhere. And then on biomass, I get, yeah, the lignocellulosic biomass from waste is more promising. And particularly if there's wastes, I kind of showed that if you've got food waste, you really want to keep those nutrients and put it back into the soil. But there's obviously some types of waste that are more difficult to digest. They have less nutrients in them. They are mostly carbon. And then there's a conversation about what makes sense to then turn into energy because it's difficult to do that with. And then that makes the most sense for aviation there. But just recognizing that's going to be relatively limited and it's going to be a lot more expensive, whatever you do. So our opinion is let's get aviation ready for that higher cost, whether it's advanced biofuels, e-fuels, or just burning jet fuel and running direct air capture. All of those things are multiple times more expensive. So let's start increasing that carbon price today so that we don't hit ourselves with a big wall of pricing in 10, 15 years' time. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you. Can I just ask one follow-on question?
Yeah, sure.
What's your opinion on the Firefly plan to use sewage for biofuel?
Yeah. So that kind of it again, like well, I actually it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because it seems like we have an issue with waste, like human waste and animal waste going into our rivers, polluting our rivers. Part of that is because it's so nutrient dense and it encourages algae blooms and there's too much of it. So I talked to a waste management person at university that's specifically looking at using human waste. And they were saying this to me. They were saying, well, it's got all of these nutrients in it. So that is nutrients that are like really valuable for growing more food, so that we don't need more fossil fuel fertilizer. And I think that that's the question, is saying we need to, it looks great. We can just say we can turn poo into fuel. That seems perfect, but actually what's the alternative uses? And does it make sense to subsidize that over feeding people as well? And I've not seen the comparison that says this is how much emissions you'd save by making fertilizer, this is how much jet fuel. I'd imagine you'd get a similar graph that I showed you to e-fuels. That's not to say it's not worth investigating though, because maybe there's some stuff in different sewage that actually it's got chemicals in it that can't be removed, that is dangerous. We can't use it for growing food. Okay, let's make it into a jet fuel, but let's make sure that we've gone through that process, rather than assuming it will work.
Thank you.
Cool.
That's great.
Morris, you could.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for the presentation and like quite a strong overview of different perspectives on all the different options. Many of the arguments I have seen before, but not like in this summary. But like, yeah, also when I see it together, it feels quite pessimistic and in a way also a bit of a disconnect between like what I see in the industry happen and also a little bit with like how business principles work, how our societies are organized, and how business by itself run towards certain principles, right? Like for business, it's very difficult to optimize multiple industries at the same time. Like you say cross-industry prioritization, etc. That's very difficult to organize for business because they run best to one specific goal. That's how the business is more efficient than a conglomerate or etc. So like I was just a little bit wondering, like, what are your perspectives on this? Like it's good that like these perspectives become more visible, but how do you make sure that aviation goes somewhere? And I guess as a sub question is, how do you see as like, okay, in general, we see that aviation is growing for the next 20 to 30 years and quite drastically in countries mostly that are less focused on sustainability at this point in time. So what would you say, okay, what are the best, most effective way and what is responsible mobility on a global perspective? Okay, a lot of questions.
Really good questions. So I think the first thing about I understand what you're saying about, just it doesn't sound like a very positive picture here, right? It seems quite pessimistic. Something we actually really want to do, because what the industry is saying is so frustratingly optimistic, it feels like we need to counter that with realism and some honest pessimism. And that's kind of partly what our group does. But we do think we need to be positive and provide a vision that is, people ultimately don't want to just listen to us and say, well, that all sounds pretty negative. I'd rather listen to the people that say it's all going to work. So I think the real positives of our position is that we're actually really struggling to decarbonize the rest of our economy because of cost. And aviation is a really untapped area of growing rev. And I think aviation could be harnessed as a force for good to grow our renewable electricity supply and collect sustainable biomass and improve our waste management. And I think we'd be really proud of our industry if we actually acknowledged these things and then we went about cross-sector decarbonisation in a way that was facilitated with aviation, but like with also our best interests at heart, because that's then enabling the feedstock to be available that we could then use in the future. I think that's the positive story, really. The other positive is we could save a lot of money by not focusing on things that are dead ends. I think we stand to waste billions on these really expensive facilities that actually in 10, 15 years' time, we're going to have to close. So there's a lot of time and money we could save, again, a really positive. The other thing is if you do start to rule out these really cheap feedstocks that are relatively unsustainable and you do start ramping up the carbon price, in aviation, we will then see a lot of radical engineering development of aircraft because suddenly efficiency will be even more important. And this will cause us to have to innovate more and actually jump to more radically efficient aircraft concepts. This is where I was working, Airbus and Boeing, really risk averse and not wanting to take the jump away from their current aircraft designs. So I think actually we could enter a kind of golden age of aviation innovation that's really exciting for aviation workers and is actually going to create more employment, even within the constraints of actually us needing to reduce our energy use. And I think from a global justice perspective, this is a little bit of a wider thing, but the point here is really that at the moment we're really exacerbating global injustice because it's a small minority of people who are flying, creating these climate impacts that people in lower income countries are more exposed to. And then they also can't like pay for repairing that damage, but also developing technology. So if we genuinely cared about kind of social justice, we would firstly really limit emissions as much as possible, particularly in the global north, North America and Europe, and China. And then we'd also the money that we'd raise, we'd use that for loss and damage, and we'd use it for renewable and like energy development in the global south as well. And there's a variety of things that we could do if we really cared about social justice, where we could fly less in the global north and do a lot of good in the global south. And we're really open to that conversation as well. But I think it's maybe misleading to say if we just grow aviation in general, that will benefit everybody, because at the moment it's benefiting a small amount of people and it's disadvantaging a lot more as well. But yeah, really keen to, we should probably have another separate lunch and learn on that aspect itself. Owen.
Hey, Finley, greetings from the US. Great presentation. I'm curious about you referenced a article about the US subsidizing corn ethanol to SAF. They recently published that corn ethanol would qualify for subsidies under the requirement that it provides 50% CO2 reduction from fossil jet fuel. I guess my question to you is your sources say that corn ethanol does not provide that benefit, 50%, or is there, I guess, a position that their land use change assumption is incorrect, or there are certain instances in which corn ethanol can provide that benefit depending on the land that it's developed on? And then a second question is, how do you recommend aviation workers spread these positions within their companies and within the industry, understanding that their companies may be the ones supporting the lobbying going on for these alternative fuels?
Yeah, well, the big difference is the important thing in these calculations is it's the life cycle analysis or life cycle assessment, LCA, that's done for this. And this is what gives us our 50% saving or 70% or 80% or 90%. But this is the thing. So if you look at an electro-fuel, you might say, well, we're making it from renewable electricity. So, and actually, there's not much fossil fuel emissions used to make a wind turbine and that sort of thing. So we could get down to 95% emission saving versus fossil fuel. If we put on our kind of goggles and we just look at aviation in a silo and don't assume wider world impacts, the problem is that opportunity cost I showed. So we could have used the same resource, the same renewable electricity, to decarbonize another sector and got 5 times the amount of emission savings. So if that's your baseline, then using the electricity for jet fuel has actually made emissions worse. And then the same is true when you look at biofuels, but rather than electricity, you look at land. So the important thing in the models is the assumptions that you use about what would have happened if you didn't do anything. And particular things at play when you look at biofuels is sort of saying, well, like in the UK, we've already deforested the majority of our country and covered it in farms. And so then if you say, well, grow some biofuels there, you say, well, we're not doing any deforestation. But actually, if you scale back biofuels, you could then reforest that land and maximize carbon savings. And if that is your baseline, then crop-based biofuels start to look really bad. There's then other things in the assumptions as well to do with, well, maybe the agricultural practice is a bit better. Maybe they're using, like within the subsidies, they're talking about using like precision agriculture, certain types of fertilizer, cover crops that can maybe help store a bit more nutrients in the soil, all of that stuff. But on a global scale, when you look at the fact that our population is growing, so that we're going to need to eat more food, population is also increasing in GDP and we're eating more meat. All of those things are putting pressure on land, and then we're adding biofuels on the top, whether it's in the US, Europe, South America, Southeast Asia. The net effect is that we're deforesting the planet at a massive rate still, and we're not reversing that. And I don't think credibly you can make, that's why the life cycle analysis is simply not credible to me at all, because you can see reality is that we're expanding land pressures and that's leading to deforestation. So I think it's fundamentally that life cycle assessment. I think as the environmental movement kind of spends too long trying to tweak, is it 50% or 60%? And actually the whole thing isn't credible because it's the assumptions of what we could use that resource for is actually the important way to look at it. And you can just see if what I showed you in terms of that land area, you could put some solar on it and decarbonize the grid, and then just return it to nature, and you still have enough energy to do other things. And that baseline is so much better than covering the entire thing in crops. Now, obviously, the difficult part there is then the political question around agricultural lobbies pushing for this stuff, and farmers who work on that land wanting work. But I think there's a lot of ways that we can do that in a way that we get a lot more work for these people, and we're avoiding that conversation by disguising it with these life cycle assessments. And that's why I'm really keen to, it's the opportunity cost, finding what is the best use of that land and what's the opportunity cost versus that. And usually that's the detail that means that they can get this claimed emission saving. Yeah, I know you've got a bit of thoughts around this as well, though. So I'm interested what your thoughts are.
I guess my thoughts or my position is that I've had these conversations with colleagues within my company that are working kind of the government side and the policy side on this, and they believe that we can, that now that we're taking a very close look at these SAF pathways, and we can use carbon capture on top of the corn ethanol fermentation processes, that we can put in the policies in place to ensure that we get those 50% reduction savings, and that this is going to be different than prior biofuel processes like the corn ethanol we've been growing for the past 15 years in the United States. I think this is different now, and that it actually will work. And so I guess my personal opinion is in that it's a very big risk of just leading to more deforestation. But I'm trying to just gather more knowledge so I can have effective conversations.
So I think, so obviously this is the thing. So putting carbon capture, I mean, but to try and explain it, you've got some corn ethanol, some carbon in the corn, and usually you'd ferment that to produce the ethanol, and that releases CO2, a bit like in a brewery making beer, and you can capture that CO2 and then can put that underground, and you're getting some carbon capture at the same time as you're getting your fuel production. I think we should be developing that, but it's the same as, I mean, effectively what you're talking about there is the bioenergy carbon capture. So we should be developing that. Again, though, it's sort of saying, well, if we scale that up, how much land does it use, and what's the alternative use? Because potentially, if you're just saying, actually, we're going to rewild, or we're going to put solar on that land, and we're going to run direct air capture, how much emission savings do you get from that with using a lot less land as well. And then the next thing is the cost. So corn ethanol at the moment is already subsidized. If you're then adding carbon capture on, which is an inefficient process, how much cost, what is the cost of a litre or a kilogram of that fuel? Are we factoring that into our business assumptions, Airbus, Boeing, General Electric, Rolls-Royce, Safran, and are we designing for those higher costs of fuel as well? So I suppose what we could say is maybe some will be possible, but there's limits to that. And what's the limit? How much land should we use for growing? And also in the meantime, how quickly can we scale up that stuff? And does it mean like we're still not focusing on fossil fuels? Because the other aspect is if we scale all of this stuff, we might also still be growing fossil fuels. And if we're not displacing fossil fuels, then we're still doing more harm. But yeah, keen to discuss that with you more. And actually, yeah, if there's anyone that you know that is like could give us a good rundown of corn ethanol with carbon capture and why it is the solution to all our problems, we'd be really grateful for them to provide a talk to us so we can understand that perspective as well. Any questions from anybody else? Just bearing in mind we've got 5 minutes left, so we can maybe take one more. But yeah. If not, I suppose what I'm need to do, we've recorded this, we could share it, and also I can share my slide pack that has a bit more hidden slides, including calculations of where I've calculated e-fuels and that sort of thing. Feel free to have a look through that. It's all referenced. So any slide, any picture, any calculation I've done is all referenced. I'm really keen to get feedback on that. If you've listened to this and you kind of disagree with a particular part, you think there needs to be more work, really keen for that. I'm really also really interested if anybody wants to investigate any of these specific things, like what should we be doing with food waste? What will happen with corn ethanol, carbon capture? Maybe we should be doing direct air capture rather than e-fuels. If you are particularly interested in any of these topics, would like to dive into it more with our help and support, really keen to facilitate that. So please let us know. But yeah, thanks very much for joining. And if you don't have more questions, I can let you all kind of get off to your next meeting or get some lunch, whatever you're planning to do next. And yeah, just put our email in the chat. And on our website as well, you can sign up to the group if you haven't already. You'll get our monthly newsletter, which will have advertised events like this. And our next group check-in is in 2 weeks' time, Thursday as well, in the evening UK time, so 7 p.m. UK time, wherever you are. You can come and join that and have a bit more of an open check-in and chat as well. Thanks, guys.